You can have it all, I said, and the courtroom went quiet in that way rooms do when people think they're about to witness a man make the biggest mistake of his life. And across from me, Emily didn't even try to hide her smile, the kind that says the outcome is already decided, the kind that says you're finished, and her attorney leaned forward, confident, listing it all out like a menu she had already ordered from the house in Westfield, the joint accounts, the investment portfolio, the business I spent 15 years building from nothing but long days and bad coffee, and I just nodded, slow, steady, like a man agreeing to terms he understood perfectly, because I did, and the judge adjusted his glasses, pen hovering, waiting for resistance that never came, waiting for the argument that would make this interesting, but I didn't give him one, I didn't give anyone anything. Because sometimes the strongest move a man can make is to look like he's losing, and I could feel the eyes. In that room, strangers, clerks, even the bailiff, all of them watching me like I was already a story they'd tell later. That guy just handed everything over. And maybe they were right, at least on the surface, because on paper it looked clean, simple, final. Emily gets the house, Emily gets the money, Emily walks away with what she told everyone she deserved, and I let it happen. I let her speak, let her lawyer frame the narrative, let the room settle into that comfortable assumption that justice had already been served. But what they didn't see, what Emily didn't see, was how long I had been sitting with this moment, how many nights I had stared at ceilings doing the kind of math you don't write down, the kind where you don't count dollars, you count moves. And when the judge finally looked at me and asked if I understood the terms, I met his eyes and said, calm as steel, I do. And that was it, a signature away from closing the chapter everyone thought they were reading, and Emily shifted in her seat, satisfied, already moving on in her head, already picturing the house without me in it, already telling herself she won, and maybe she did, for now, because winning fast feels good, it feels clean, it feels like control, but control is a funny thing, it slips if you don't know what you're holding, and as the paperwork slid across the table toward me, I noticed the smallest detail, her fingers tapping, impatient, eager to be done, eager to leave, and that told me everything I needed to know, because people who rush don't look back, they don't double-check, they don't ask why the man they just dismantled isn't fighting. And I picked up the pen, felt its weight, light, ordinary. Nothing special, and I signed exactly where they told me to, no hesitation, no drama, just ink on paper, and a quiet breath that no one heard but me, and in that moment, as the clerk gathered the documents and the judge nodded like this was just another case moving along, I realized something simple, something that changes everything if you let it. Losing in public is easy, anyone can do it, you just have to let go. But winning in the end, that takes time, and I had plenty of that, more than Emily realized, more than anyone in that room could see, and as she stood up, already turning away, already stepping into the version of her life where she took everything, I stayed seated for 1 second longer, just enough to let the silence settle, just enough to remind myself of the truth that doesn't show up in court transcripts or legal summaries. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I didn't try to stop her. Because I didn't need to. I had already made my move long before any of us walked into that room, and while she was counting what she was about to take, I had been counting something else entirely. And numbers like that don't lie, they just wait. I stayed seated until the last chair scraped the floor and the echo of footsteps faded into the hallway, because leaving too quickly would have ruined the illusion, and illusions only work if you let people believe them all the way through, so I gave it a beat, just long enough for the room to empty, just long enough for the clerk to stack the papers without looking at me again, like I had already become irrelevant, and when I finally stood, I adjusted my jacket, same way I always did before. Stepping into a meeting slow, deliberate, controlled, because habits do not disappear just because circumstances change, and as I walked out of that courtroom, I could feel the shift, not in them, but in me, the kind of shift that happens when you stop reacting and start executing, and outside, the air hit different, colder than it should have been for late spring, or maybe it was just the silence that came with it. The kind of silence you only notice when something permanent has just happened, and my phone buzzed once in my pocket, then again, then a third time, messages stacking up, names I recognized, a few I did not, people who had heard already, because news like that moves fast, faster than truth ever does, and I did not check a single one, not yet, because timing matters more than information, and I had learned that the hard way years ago, back when I thought working harder fixed everything. Back when I believed showing up early and staying late was enough to hold a life together. But there are things effort does not fix. There are fractures that grow quietly while you are busy being responsible, and by the time you see them, they are not cracks anymore, they are fault lines, and I should have seen it sooner. The way Emily started asking different questions, not about my day, not about how the business was running, but about numbers, percentages, ownership, things she never cared about before. And I told myself it was curiosity, that it was normal, that people grow, that interests change. But looking back, I realize now that questions are rarely just questions, they are signals, and I missed a few, maybe more than a few, but I did not miss all of them, not the ones that mattered, not the ones that made me pause late at night and open files I had not looked at in years, not the ones that made me call people I trusted without explaining why, just asking quiet questions. Just confirming details that most men would never think to check, and that was when the math started to change. Not overnight, not in some dramatic moment, but piece by piece, like rebuilding something you already know is going to collapse, except this time you are choosing where it falls, and I remember sitting in my office one night, long after everyone else had gone home, the city outside dim and distant through the glass, and I had a folder open on my desk, nothing special. Just paper, ink, signatures, the kind of things that do not look powerful until you understand how they fit together, and I sat there, reading every line twice, then a third time, not because I did not trust it, but because I needed to know it cold. Needed to understand every angle, every possible move, every way it could be challenged, and more importantly, every way it could not, and when I finally leaned back in that chair, I realized something that most people never do. Control is not about what you have, it is about how it is structured, and structure does not show up in conversations, it does not impress at dinner tables, it does not get applause, but it decides outcomes long before anyone realizes a game is being played. And that was the night I stopped thinking like a husband trying to save something and started thinking like a man preparing for what comes after, and now, standing outside that courthouse with the paperwork already signed, with Emily walking away believing she had secured her future, I felt none of the panic they expected, none of the regret they were waiting to see, because the truth is simple, I did not lose anything in that room, I relocated it, I repositioned it. I let it move exactly where it needed to be so that later, when the time came, it would all come back the same way it left, quietly, legally, and without a single raised voice. And as I finally pulled my phone out and glanced at the screen, I saw her name flash across it, just once, then disappear, and I let it go unanswered because this part, this quiet stretch right after the fall, this is where most people make their biggest mistake. They react, they explain, they try to fix what has already been decided, but I was not going to do that. Not anymore, because for the first time in a long time, I was not behind, I was exactly where I needed to be, right on schedule. I drove past the house that night without slowing down, not because I did not want to look, but because I already knew what it would show me. Lights on in rooms I used to walk through without thinking, shadows moving behind curtains that used to mean home, and there is a strange clarity that comes when something familiar becomes distant, like seeing your own life from the outside and realizing how much of it you built without ever stopping to ask who you were building it for, and that thought stayed with me as I kept driving, past the neighborhood. Past the exits I used to take automatically, until the road opened up and the city lights fell behind me, because distance helps, not emotionally, but strategically. It gives you space to think without noise, and I needed that more than anything, because what came next was not about reaction, it was about precision, and precision requires quiet, and I remember the first time I started from nothing, years ago. When the business was just an idea and a rented desk in a shared office that smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink, back when 12 hours felt like a short day and weekends were just extra time to catch up, and I built it piece by piece, contract by contract, learning how to read people as much as I learned how to read numbers, because numbers tell you where you are, but people decide where things go, and that lesson cost me more than money to learn, it cost time, trust, and more than a few sleepless nights. But it also gave me something most people never develop: the ability to see patterns before they fully form, the ability to notice when behavior shifts even slightly. And Emily's shift had been subtle at first, almost invisible if you were not paying attention. The way she stopped asking about the little things, the way conversations turned transactional without ever becoming confrontational. And I told myself it was stress, that it was normal, that people change. But deep down I knew something was off, not wrong enough to confront, but not right enough to ignore, and that is the space where decisions get made long before anyone realizes there is a decision to make. And I started paying attention in a different way, not emotionally, but structurally. I looked at accounts, at ownership layers, at how everything was tied together, not because I expected anything to happen, but because I understood that if something did, it would not be sudden, it would be prepared, and preparation leaves traces, small ones, but enough if you know where to look. And I found them, not all at once, but gradually. Questions about assets that did not match her usual tone, notes left on the kitchen counter with numbers that did not belong to groceries or bills, calls taken in another room with a voice that sounded too measured to be casual, and none of it was proof, not by itself, but together it formed a pattern, and patterns do not lie, they just wait to be acknowledged. And the night I finally accepted what I was seeing, I did not confront her, I did not argue, I did not even change my routine. Because reacting too early only teaches the other person how to adjust, and I needed her to stay exactly where she was, moving exactly how she thought she was moving, and that meant I had to become predictable again, steady, reliable, the version of me she had already calculated into her plan. And that was harder than it sounds, because it meant watching something unravel without stepping in, it meant letting conversations happen without digging deeper, letting moments pass without asking questions that would give away what I knew. And that is where most people fail, not because they lack intelligence, but because they cannot sit with uncertainty without trying to fix it. And I used to be like that, but not anymore. Not after everything it took to build what I had. Because building something teaches you patience, real patience, the kind that understands timing is more important than speed. And as I drove that night with the road stretching out in front of me and the past sitting quietly behind me, I realized that this was not the first time I had started over. It just looked different this time, less visible, more controlled. And somewhere between the miles and the silence, the plan that had been forming in pieces finally felt complete, not in a dramatic way, not with some sudden realization, but with a quiet certainty that everything was already in motion. And all I had to do now was let it play out exactly as intended. I checked into a small extended stay off Route 22 that charged by the week and did not ask questions, the kind of place with thin walls, a humming air conditioner, and a desk just big enough for a laptop and a stack of papers, and that was all I needed, because rebuilding does not require comfort, it requires focus, and focus is easier when there is nothing else competing for it. So I set my bag down, opened the laptop, and pulled up the folders I had memorized, not because I needed to read them again, but because repetition sharpens certainty, and certainty is what carries you through the parts that look like loss. And as the screen lit up the room, I started laying everything out the way I always did when something mattered: clean, organized, no distractions, accounts on one side, entities on the other, ownership structures mapped in a way that only makes sense if you built them yourself. Because that was the advantage I had. I did not inherit this system, I designed it, every layer, every connection, every clause written with a purpose that only became clear when tested. And most people never test their structures, they assume stability means safety, but stability without protection is just exposure waiting for the right moment. And I had learned that early, long before Emily ever asked her first question about percentages and distributions. Back when a mentor of mine told me something that stuck. He said ownership is not what your name is on, it is what you control when everything else is taken away. And that line stayed with me as I moved pieces years ago, slowly, legally, without drawing attention, because real changes do not announce themselves, they settle quietly into place, and by the time anyone notices, they are already permanent. And I remember the first transfer, how simple it looked on paper, just another document among hundreds. But it changed the foundation. Shifted weight in a way no one could see from the outside, and then another, and another, each one small enough to avoid notice, but together forming something solid, something that did not depend on perception or assumption, something that held even when pressure came from every direction. And sitting there in that dim room, I traced those moves again, not out of doubt, but out of discipline, because discipline is what separates a plan from a reaction, and reactions fade, plans execute, and outside the window cars passed on the highway, steady, predictable, headlights cutting through the dark like a metronome marking time, and time was the one thing I had never rushed, not in business, not in life. And certainly not now, because rushing is what creates gaps, and gaps are where things break, and Emily had rushed. I could see it now more clearly than ever, the way she accelerated toward an outcome she believed was guaranteed, the way she trusted surface-level ownership without questioning what sat underneath. And I do not blame her for that. Most people operate that way. They trust what is visible, what is documented in the simplest form, what can be explained in a sentence. But complexity does not live in sentences, it lives in structures, and structures decide who stands when everything else shifts. And as I closed one file and opened another, I noticed the timestamps, dates that lined up long before any of this became public, long before the first conversation turned cold, long before the word divorce was ever spoken out loud, and that is when it became undeniable even to myself. I had not reacted to the situation, I had prepared for it. Maybe not consciously at first, maybe not with a clear end in mind, but instinct has a way of guiding decisions before logic catches up, and my instincts had been moving things into place for a long time, quietly reinforcing what mattered, quietly reducing exposure where it could be taken, and now, with everything signed and settled on the surface, those deeper layers were all that remained, untouched, intact, waiting, and I leaned back in that chair, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant rhythm of traffic. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement, because the hardest part was never losing what was visible, the hardest part was trusting that what could not be seen would hold, and now I knew it would, not because I hoped so, but because I had built it that way, piece by piece, decision by decision, long before anyone realized there was anything at stake. I woke up before the alarm, not because I had to, but because routines like that do not disappear overnight, they stay with you, wired into your system after years of repetition, and for a moment I forgot where I was, the ceiling unfamiliar, the hum of the air conditioner slightly off from what I was used to, and then it came back, not as a shock, not as a wave, just as a quiet fact settling into place. And I sat up slowly, letting the silence stretch, because mornings tell you a lot about where you stand. They show you what is left when everything else is stripped away, and what I felt was not panic, not regret, just a steady awareness that the situation had moved exactly where it needed to be, and I reached for my phone, not to check messages, not to look for updates, but to confirm timing, because timing was the only variable that mattered now, and there it was, a notification from the bank, routine on the surface. But I knew better. I opened it without hesitation, reading every line once, then again, and a small detail stood out, a delay, subtle, easy to dismiss if you did not know what to look for, but delays do not happen without reason, not in systems designed to move efficiently, and I set the phone down, not reacting, just acknowledging, because this was the first ripple, the first indication that what looked complete on paper was not functioning the way it was expected to. And somewhere across town, in a house she believed was fully hers, Emily was probably starting her morning the way she always did, coffee on the counter, phone in hand, already moving through her day with the confidence of someone who thinks the hard part is over, and that confidence is dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it blinds you to the details that matter, and I had seen that pattern before, in business, in negotiations, in deals where one side believed they had already won, they stopped checking. They stop questioning, they move forward assuming everything will follow the script they have written, and that is when things begin to shift, quietly at first, almost unnoticeable, like a slight resistance where there should be none, and I knew she would notice it soon, maybe not immediately, but soon enough, because systems like this do not fail loudly, they hesitate, they stall, they ask for verification, they introduce friction where there used to be flow, and friction creates questions, and questions lead to calls. And calls lead to conversations that do not go the way they are expected to, and I stood up, walked to the small kitchenette, poured a cup of coffee that tasted exactly like it should not, bitter, thin, but functional, and that was enough, because this was not about comfort, it was about execution, and as I leaned against the counter, I let my mind run through the sequence again, not because I was unsure, but because repetition sharpens timing, and timing decides outcomes. And the sequence was simple on the surface: assets reassigned, control retained, visibility reduced, each step legal, documented, irreversible, but layered in a way that required understanding to navigate, and understanding was not something she had, not because she was not capable, but because she had never needed it before, and people rarely develop skills they do not think they will need, and that was the gap, the difference between what she believed she owned and what she could actually access. And I took a slow sip of coffee, letting that thought settle, because this was the moment where most people would feel something, satisfaction, maybe even a sense of justice, but I did not yet, because the process was still unfolding, and outcomes only matter when they are complete, and until then, everything is just movement, and movement requires patience, and patience is something I had already proven I could maintain, because I had lived through the part that breaks most people. The part where you let go publicly while holding on privately, the part where you allow the narrative to move against you without correcting it, without defending yourself, because defending yourself too early exposes what you are protecting. And now, as the day began to take shape outside that small window, cars moving, people starting routines that had nothing to do with me, I understood that this phase, this quiet, controlled unraveling, was where the real shift happened, not in the courtroom, not in the signatures, but here, in the unseen mechanics of ownership and control, where what is written meets what is real. And I checked my phone one more time, not for her name, not for any message, just for confirmation that the system was behaving exactly as designed, and it was. Every detail aligning, every delay intentional, every restriction placed long before it was needed, and I set the phone down again, calm, steady, because now it was no longer about what I had done, it was about what would happen next, and that part was already in motion. I did not have to wait long for the next signal, because systems under pressure reveal themselves faster than people expect, and by mid-morning my phone lit up again, not with noise, not with panic, but with something far more telling, a formal notification, structured language, precise wording, the kind that comes from institutions, not individuals, and I opened it slowly, already knowing what it would say before I read it. Because there are only so many ways a system can respond when control does not match ownership, and there it was, a request for additional verification, temporary restrictions placed on certain transfers, standard procedure on the surface. But nothing about this was standard, not in timing, not in scope, not in how it connected to everything else I had already seen, and I leaned back in the chair, letting that information settle into place, not reacting, just observing. Because this was exactly how it was supposed to unfold, not dramatic, not immediate, just a sequence of small interruptions that would build into something unavoidable, and somewhere across town Emily was now in that sequence, whether she realized it yet or not, moving from confidence into confusion, from confusion into concern, and eventually into the part where she starts asking the wrong questions to the wrong people, because when something does not work the way you expect, the instinct is to push harder, to call, to demand, to assume there is a mistake that needs correcting. But what she was about to discover was that there was no mistake, only structure, and structure does not respond to pressure, it responds to authority. And authority is not what she thought she had, and I could picture it clearly without being there, the moment her expression changes, subtle at first, a pause between actions that used to be automatic. The second attempt at a transfer that should have gone through the first time, the call placed with a tone that starts calm but tightens with each answer that does not match expectation, and I had seen that moment before, not in her, but in others, clients, competitors, partners who thought they understood the system until the system reminded them they did not, and it is always the same progression: confidence, confusion, denial, then realization, and realization is where everything shifts. Because that is when people start looking deeper, start asking not just what is happening, but why. And why is where the real answers live, the ones that are not written in simple terms, the ones that require context, history, understanding of how decisions made months or years ago connect to the present, and that is not something you can build in a single phone call, it is something you either have or you do not. And I took another slow sip of coffee, now cold, barely noticeable, and set it down without finishing it, because my attention was elsewhere, on the pattern, on the sequence, on how each piece was aligning exactly as intended, and there was a moment, brief but clear, where I considered reaching out, not to explain, not to engage, but just to acknowledge, because part of me still remembered what it meant to share a life with someone, to sit across from them and talk through problems instead of designing around them, but that part had already been accounted for, already processed and set aside. Because this was no longer about us, it was about outcomes. And outcomes require distance, require discipline, require the ability to let things play out without interference. And interference is what weakens a plan, not strengthens it. And as I picked up my phone again, I saw her name, not as a message this time, but as a missed call, then another, then a third, spaced just enough to show escalation, and I did not answer, not because I was avoiding her, but because this was not a conversation that needed words. Everything that needed to be said was already written, already filed, already in motion, and words would only complicate what was already clear, and I set the phone face down on the desk, letting the screen go dark, because this phase required silence. Not just from me, but from the entire situation, silence that forces clarity, silence that removes distractions, silence that leaves only the structure standing, and I knew that somewhere in that process, as calls went unanswered and responses became more formal, more distant, more controlled, she would start to see it, not all at once, but piece by piece, the same way I had built it, the same way it was now unfolding. And when that realization fully settled, when the last assumption gave way to understanding, that would be the moment everything changed, not because I would say anything, but because the system would have already said it for me. By the afternoon the pattern was no longer subtle, it had moved past hesitation into resistance, the kind that forces attention whether you want to give it or not, and I could see it in the sequence of missed calls stacking on my phone, not just from her now, but from numbers I recognized as well, the firm she had used, the advisor who once shook my hand like we were on the same side of the table, and I let each one ring out. Not because I was ignoring them, but because this part required distance, because once you engage, you give them a chance to reframe, to negotiate, to look for angles that only exist when there is still a conversation to be had, and this was no longer a conversation, this was execution, and execution does not need explanation, it only needs time, and I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of those calls, the tone shifting from confident to controlled. From controlled to urgent, the questions getting sharper, more specific, the kind that indicates someone is no longer asking for confirmation but for answers they did not expect to need, and I could picture Emily sitting at that kitchen counter, the same one where she used to leave those notes, now covered in documents that did not align the way she thought they would, her phone pressed to her ear, listening to explanations that sounded technical but carried a simple truth underneath, that what she believed she had secured was not accessible the way she assumed. And that is when the real pressure begins, not when something is taken, but when something cannot be used, because ownership without control is just a word on paper, and paper does not move anything by itself, and I stood by the window, watching traffic build as the day pushed forward, people moving through their routines unaware of how quickly a situation can shift when the foundation underneath it changes, and I remembered the exact moment I built that foundation, not in a dramatic setting, not in some high-stakes meeting, but in a quiet office with a single advisor who understood what I was asking before I finished explaining it, a man who did not talk much, did not sell ideas, just listened, then nodded once and said, "If you want to protect something, you do not put it where people expect to find it, you put it where it makes sense legally but not obviously," and that line stayed with me, shaped the way I approached everything after, because obvious structures are easy to dismantle. But layered ones require understanding, and understanding takes time, and time was the one thing she did not give herself, And now that gap was closing in, slowly but completely, and my phone buzzed again, this time not a call but a message, short, direct, not emotional, just a name and a request to talk, and I read it once, then set the phone down without responding, because this was the stage where clarity replaces assumption, where the narrative shifts from what someone thought happened to what actually exists. And I knew that behind that message was a realization. Forming, not fully clear yet, but strong enough to demand attention, strong enough to break through the confidence that had carried her this far, and I did not feel satisfaction, not the kind people expect. In moments like this, because this was never about proving something, it was about protecting what I built, and protection does not celebrate, it confirms, and as the light outside started to fade into that late afternoon tone, I understood that the sequence had reached its turning point, the moment where everything that was hidden becomes unavoidable, not because it is revealed in a single statement, but because every path forward leads to the same conclusion, and that conclusion does not need to be spoken out loud. It is understood the moment you realize that what you thought you held was never fully yours to control, and I stayed where I was, steady, quiet, letting the system finish what it had already started, because there was nothing left for me to add, nothing left to adjust. Everything that mattered had already been decided long before any of this became visible. And now it was simply a matter of letting reality catch up to perception, one step at a time. By evening the calls stopped, and that silence told me more than anything they could have said, because when people run out of questions, it means they have found answers they were not ready for, and I could feel the shift without hearing a single word, the kind that settles heavy, not loud, not dramatic, just final. And I knew exactly where she was in that moment, not physically, but mentally, sitting in a space that no longer felt secure. Surrounded by things that looked like hers but did not respond like they should, and that is a different kind of realization, not the kind that hits all at once, but the kind that unfolds piece by piece, each detail confirming what the last one suggested, until there is no version of the situation left that supports what you believed before, and I let that sit. Did not reach for my phone, did not check for messages, because this was not something that needed to be monitored. It had already reached the point where it would carry itself forward, and I stepped outside for the first time that day, the air cooler now, the sky fading into that deep blue that comes just before night fully takes over, and there was a calm in that moment that had nothing to do with relief. It was clarity, the kind that only shows up when everything unnecessary has been stripped away. And as I stood there, I thought about the house, not as an asset, not as something listed on paper, but as a place where years had been spent, decisions made, routines built, and it is easy to reduce things to numbers when you are in a process like that, easy to forget what they actually represent, but I never did. That was the difference. I understood both sides of it, the value on paper and the weight behind it, and that is why I protected it the way I did, not out of attachment, but out of principle. Because what you build matters not just in terms of what it is worth, but in terms of what it represents about you, and letting it go without understanding that would have been the real loss, not the transfer, not the signatures, but the meaning behind it, and I had no intention of losing that. And somewhere in the distance a car door closed, footsteps moved across pavement, ordinary sounds that carried on without interruption, and that was another thing I had learned over time. No matter how significant something feels in your own life, the world does not stop for it, everything keeps moving, and that can either break you or ground you, depending on how you see it, and for me it was grounding. It reminded me that this was just another sequence, another situation that required attention, not emotion. And I went back inside, sat at the desk again, and this time when I opened the files, I was not reviewing, I was confirming. Making sure every piece had moved into its final position, and it had, every layer intact, every connection holding exactly as designed, and there was a certain finality in that, not an ending, but a completion of a phase, the part where preparation transitions into outcome, and my phone lit up once more, a message this time, longer than before, not structured, not controlled, but not chaotic either, somewhere in between, and I read it without reacting. Every word aligning with what I already knew, questions framed as statements, confusion trying to sound like certainty, and beneath it all, the realization that the situation was not what it seemed, and I set the phone down without replying, because there was nothing I could say that would change what had already been established, no explanation that would make it easier, no clarification that would undo the structure in place. And sometimes the most honest response is silence, not because you are avoiding the situation, but because the situation no longer requires your input. And I leaned back in the chair, letting that truth settle. Because this was the point where everything aligned, not just the plan, but the reality of it, the confirmation that what had been built quietly over time could hold under pressure, could withstand challenge, could stand on its own without needing to be defended. And that is something most people never experience, because they build for appearance, not for resilience, and resilience is what matters when everything else is stripped away. And as the room grew darker and the hum of the air conditioner became the only constant sound, I understood that what came next would not require action from me, it would unfold on its own, because the structure was already doing what it was designed to do, and all that was left now was time. The next morning did not come with noise, it came with confirmation, the kind that does not need interpretation, and when I opened my phone there were no missed calls this time, no scattered attempts to reach me, just one message, short, direct, and stripped of everything that had been there before, no confidence, no control, just a request to meet, and I read it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because of what it represented, the shift from assumption to reality. And I let it sit there for a moment before responding, not immediately, not impulsively, just a simple time and place, neutral, public, controlled, because even now, especially now, structure mattered, and a few hours later I walked into a quiet coffee shop just off Main Street, the kind of place where conversations blend into background noise and no one pays attention to who sits across from who, and she was already there. Sitting near the window, posture different than I remembered, not weaker, just uncertain, like someone recalibrating in real time, and when I sat down across from her, there was a pause, not awkward, just loaded, the kind that carries everything that has already happened without needing to be said, and she started speaking first, carefully, choosing words the way people do when they are trying to stay in control of something that is already slipping, talking about errors, delays, things that did not process correctly. And I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I understood exactly where she was in that progression, still trying to frame the situation in a way that made sense within what she thought she knew, and when she finished, I waited a second, just long enough for the silence to settle before I responded, not with explanation, not with argument, just a simple statement, calm, steady. There are no errors. And that was it, no raised voice, no emphasis, just clarity, and I watched it land, watched the shift happen in her expression, subtle but undeniable, the moment when possibility collapses into understanding, and she asked another question, more direct this time, about ownership, about access, about why things were not aligning with what was signed, and I gave her the only answer that mattered, not in detail, not in technical terms, just the truth in its simplest form. You have what you were given, but you do not control what you think you do. And that was when the room seemed to quiet, not literally, but in that internal way, where everything else fades because one realization takes up all the space, and she sat back slightly, processing, connecting pieces that had been separate before, and I could see it happening, not confusion anymore, but understanding, the kind that does not need to be explained further because it completes itself, and I did not push, did not elaborate, because there was no need, everything that mattered was already in place, already functioning, and after a moment she asked what came next, not with demand, not with anger, just with a level tone that carried more weight than anything she had said before, and I met her eyes and answered just as simply, nothing from me. Because that was the truth, I had already done everything required, there was no move left to make, no action needed to enforce what was already established, and that was the difference between reaction and preparation. One requires constant effort, the other stands on its own. And we sat there for another minute, maybe two, not speaking, just letting the situation exist as it was, no longer theoretical, no longer negotiable, just real. And when I finally stood up, I did not rush, did not hesitate, just moved the way I always had, steady, deliberate, and as I stepped outside into the late morning light, I felt something settle, not relief, not victory, just completion, the kind that comes when a process runs its course exactly as it was designed to, and I walked down the street without looking back, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required my attention. Everything that mattered had already been accounted for, and as the noise of the city filled in around me, ordinary, constant, unchanged, I understood something simple that most people miss. You do not win by taking everything at once, you win by taking your time, by building something that cannot be undone when tested, and by the time anyone realizes what happened, it is already over.